In medieval Europe, a traveler could walk into a tavern seeking warmth, food, and safety, only to discover he had stepped into a place more dangerous to his health than the road outside, because these establishments, often romanticized today as lively gathering spots filled with laughter and song, were in reality breeding grounds of disease, deception, violence, and filth so severe that some city authorities quietly considered them public hazards rather than businesses. The truth that unsettles modern imagination is that taverns were rarely cleaned in any meaningful sense, their floors layered with years of spilled ale, grease, mud, and bodily waste that mixed into a permanent sludge underfoot, while straw scattered across the ground to absorb liquids was replaced so infrequently that it became a living carpet of fleas, lice, and vermin. Travelers arriving after weeks on muddy roads added their own dirt and parasites to the environment, and because bathing was uncommon and clean clothing scarce, the air inside grew thick with the odor of sweat, smoke, spoiled drink, and rotting food. The cups passed between patrons were seldom washed, simply wiped with a sleeve or rinsed quickly in murky water, allowing illness to travel from mouth to mouth with every shared drink. Food preparation was no more reassuring, as meat of uncertain age hung near open hearths, where flies gathered freely, and stews simmered in pots that were rarely emptied completely, meaning each day's meal contained remnants of countless previous ones. In such places hunger overcame caution, and people ate not because they trusted the food, but because refusing it meant starvation. Taverns were also magnets for rats, drawn by crumbs and waste, and these animals moved openly among booths and benches, sometimes bold enough to climb onto tables, unchallenged by owners who considered them an unavoidable part of business. What made these conditions especially haunting was how ordinary they seemed to those who lived at the time, because discomfort and contamination were woven into daily life so completely that few expected better. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, sharing space with strangers whose pasts were unknown and whose intentions could change with drink, while arguments sparked easily in crowded rooms where alcohol flowed faster than patience. Fights broke out with alarming frequency, fueled by misunderstandings, gambling disputes, or insults that might have been ignored in calmer circumstances. And once violence began, tavern keepers rarely intervened unless property was threatened. Weapons were common possessions, and a quarrel could escalate from harsh words to bloodshed within moments, leaving stains on floors already darkened by years of spills. Yet despite all this, taverns remained essential to medieval life, serving as inns, meeting halls, marketplaces, and news centers where travelers exchanged information and locals gathered to hear rumors from distant regions. They were places of necessity rather than comfort, spaces where survival and risk existed side by side, and where a person might gain a meal, a story, or a wound before the night ended. The haunting reality of medieval taverns lies not only in their filth or danger, but in the realization that they reflected the world outside their doors, a world where hardship was normal, sanitation was rare, and safety was never guaranteed, making each visit less a casual stop and more a gamble with fate. What made medieval taverns even more unsettling was the quiet understanding that danger there did not always come from visible threats, but often from the unseen forces that lingered in every cup, corner, and conversation, because these establishments functioned as crossroads where travelers, merchants, soldiers, laborers, and wanderers converged, bringing with them not only stories and goods but illnesses that spread silently through crowded rooms long before anyone understood how disease traveled. A single infected visitor could unknowingly pass sickness to dozens in one evening simply by sharing a drink, coughing near a table, or sleeping on a communal mattress, and because medical knowledge was limited, outbreaks were often blamed on fate or divine will rather than contamination. Beds offered to overnight guests were rarely washed between occupants, sometimes shared by strangers on the same night, and the straw stuffing inside mattresses became reservoirs of parasites that fed freely on whoever lay down. Even the water used for washing dishes or diluting ale could be drawn from polluted sources, making refreshment itself a risk, Yet people continued to gather in taverns because they served essential social functions that could not be replaced, acting as informal courts where disputes were settled, hiring halls, where workers found employment, and communication hubs where news traveled faster than official messengers. In an age without newspapers or rapid communication, taverns were among the few places where information circulated widely, giving them influence that extended far beyond their walls. This importance created an uneasy balance between necessity and hazard, because authorities understood that shutting taverns down entirely would disrupt trade and community life, even as complaints about crime and disorder increased. Some taverns became known for attracting thieves and swindlers who watched newcomers carefully, waiting for signs of wealth or vulnerability, then following them outside into dark streets where witnesses were scarce. Travelers often learned too late that friendliness inside could turn into betrayal once the door closed behind them, and stories circulated of guests drugged, robbed, or worse, after accepting drinks from strangers. The keepers themselves varied greatly, with some attempting to maintain order, while others profited quietly from illicit activities conducted under their roofs, choosing silence over intervention as long as coins continued to flow. Over time, certain taverns gained reputations that spread across regions, their names spoken cautiously among merchants who warned each other which places to avoid and which might be safer despite their grime. Still, even the better establishments could not escape the realities of the era, because sanitation, law enforcement, and infrastructure were limited everywhere, and taverns simply concentrated these challenges into a single space. What emerges from historical accounts is not merely a picture of dirty buildings filled with rough company, but a deeper understanding of how medieval society functioned, revealing a world where risk was constant and safety was relative, and where stepping into a tavern meant accepting a temporary refuge that might just as easily become a source of danger before morning arrived. Another haunting reality of medieval taverns was the way they blurred the boundary between hospitality and exploitation, because while they offered shelter and drink, they also operated within an economic system that rewarded manipulation as much as service, and many tavern keepers understood that travelers, especially those unfamiliar with local customs, could be easily overcharged, misled, or deceived without immediate consequence. Prices for food and lodging were rarely fixed, often changing depending on a guest's appearance, accent, or perceived wealth, and outsiders who questioned the cost risked hostility from both staff and regular patrons who sided instinctively with the establishment. Measures of ale or wine were inconsistent, sometimes deliberately short, and watered drinks were common enough that seasoned travelers learned to watch closely as their cups were filled. Food substitutions occurred quietly, with cheaper ingredients replacing promised ones, and because written menus did not exist, disputes over what had been ordered were nearly impossible to resolve. Payment itself could be dangerous, since displaying a full purse revealed one's resources to anyone nearby, and taverns were among the first places thieves searched for potential targets. These practices were not always viewed as immoral within the context of the time, but rather as part of a competitive environment where survival depended on profit and wit. The result was an atmosphere where trust was fragile and vigilance essential, forcing patrons to balance their need for rest against the possibility of being cheated or robbed before dawn. Compounding this unease was the role taverns played as unofficial stages for human drama, where tensions from the outside world found expression in confined spaces filled with alcohol and emotion. Soldiers returning from campaigns, laborers exhausted from work, merchants anxious about trade, and wanderers carrying private troubles all converged in the same rooms, bringing with them frustrations that could surface suddenly. Arguments sparked over politics, religion, debts, or insults both real and imagined, and because medieval societies often placed great emphasis on honor and reputation, even minor slights could provoke confrontations that escalated quickly. Tavern furniture was sturdy for a reason, as overturned benches and shattered mugs were common during disputes, and injuries were treated as unfortunate but expected outcomes rather than shocking events. Yet these same spaces also witnessed moments of camaraderie, storytelling, and shared laughter, revealing a paradox at the heart of tavern life. They were places of danger and connection at once, reflecting the unpredictable nature of human interaction itself. Historical records suggest that many people accepted this duality as inevitable, understanding that the risks were inseparable from the benefits, and that the same crowded room capable of hosting a brawl could just as easily provide companionship in a lonely world. In this way, medieval taverns became mirrors of the societies that sustained them, showing not only the grime and disorder of daily existence, but also the deep human need to gather, speak, and be seen, even when doing so meant stepping into an environment where comfort was uncertain and safety could never be fully guaranteed. The final unsettling truth about medieval taverns lies in how completely they exposed the fragile boundary between civilization and chaos, because these establishments functioned as small worlds unto themselves, where rules shifted, identities blurred, and the order of everyday life could dissolve within a single evening. In a time when most people lived under strict social hierarchies and rigid expectations, the tavern offered a rare space where rank could temporarily soften, allowing peasants, tradesmen, travelers, and sometimes even minor nobles to share benches and drink from the same vessels. Yet this mingling did not create equality so much as it created unpredictability. Without the structured oversight present in courts or churches, behavior depended largely on mood, alcohol, and circumstance, and this freedom often revealed aspects of human nature that polite society preferred to keep hidden. Lies were told more easily, alliances formed and dissolved quickly, and strangers reinvented themselves with stories that could not be verified. A man might claim to be a merchant one night and a soldier the next, knowing few would challenge him, and such uncertainty added to the uneasy atmosphere that surrounded these places. Trust became a temporary arrangement rather than a stable condition, and those who survived tavern life with their money and reputation intact often did so because they learned to read subtle signs of danger in tone, posture, and expression. For many, especially travelers far from home, entering a tavern required the same alertness as walking a dark road, because threats did not always announce themselves openly. Yet despite this ever-present tension, people continued to gather there, drawn by the promise of warmth, conversation, and relief from isolation, proving that even in environments filled with risk, the desire for connection remained stronger than fear. Looking back across centuries, the haunting reality of medieval taverns is not simply that they were dirty, violent, or dishonest places, but that they represented a concentrated form of everyday life in a harsher world, where comfort was scarce, security uncertain, and survival often depended on adaptability. They reveal how communities functioned when infrastructure was limited, when law enforcement was inconsistent, and when knowledge about hygiene or disease was minimal. Within their walls, one can glimpse the rhythms of medieval society more vividly than in castles or cathedrals, because taverns brought together ordinary people whose experiences rarely appeared in official chronicles. These establishments were stages where the unseen majority of history lived out their evenings, negotiating friendships, rivalries, bargains, and survival in real time. The grime, noise, and danger that filled them were not anomalies but reflections of the broader environment beyond their doors, reminding us that the past was not a polished tableau, but a complex and often uncomfortable reality. To understand medieval taverns is to understand how people endured uncertainty with resilience, accepting risks that modern minds might find unbearable, yet which they considered routine. Their existence stands as a testament to humanity, its enduring ability to seek companionship even in imperfect conditions, and to build social spaces in the midst of hardship, proving that throughout history, people have gathered together not because the world was safe, but because facing it alone was far more frightening.